I should preface part two of the Anneke Lucas interview by saying that this interview may be triggering. I should also add that the horrors of Anneke's story seem incomprehensible, and I suggest that you read her book, Quest for Love, Memoir of a Child Sex Slave, and decide for yourself if the events that she delineates are reality. I will say that survivors of extreme abuse who have written books describe horrors that correspond to the horrors described by Anneke. I previously had psychologists on my podcast who have counseled survivors of extreme abuse, and their accounts of the abuse endured by their patients also correspond to the abuse described by Anneke. Moreover, I've done 3 podcasts on the Extreme Abuse Survey, which encompasses 1,471 persons from 31 countries. And many of their answers to the survey correspond to the abuse suffered by survivors of extreme abuse who have written books. I've been researching and writing about child trafficking for 22 years, and I've concluded that evil protects itself 2 ways: by its viciousness and by its lies. People can't believe that adults can be so vicious to children, and they experience acute cognitive dissonance. And then there's the lies that are dispensed, denying that such abuse ever occurred. My book, The Franklin Scandal, is an impeccable example of evil protecting itself by viciousness and lies. And you said this about predators and the children that they prey upon. Emotional pain of this magnitude leaves no room for kindness or generosity, which flow out of the abundance of love. The killers, the slaves, and the brokenhearted only know passion. The painful cry for love in its ruins. And there must have been a point when you were putting all this together where you were starving for love.
All the time.
And how were you able to sate that starvation?
That's very difficult. It's very difficult. I screamed for love a lot, but I think it's my connection to spirit that, well, that's everything anyway, because you can't heal without it. I also received that grace while I was in the network as a child. There was both the presence, and the different insights or whatever I needed sometimes. And then, of course, the near-death experience, which really gave me a taste of that love. What it's really meant to be, I think the network in general works really hard because, okay, so we have the network are a bunch of people who don't understand love at all and who don't know it. And because they don't know it, they believe it doesn't exist. And or they will laugh at it, they'll think it's naivete or whatever, anything having to do with love and innocence and so forth. So they create a belief system based on, their lack. And well, a lot of survivors did not have, like me, the woman who cared for me and loved me, but they have direct connection to spirit. And that near-death experience really showed me, when you feel that bliss and that expansion, and when you're sitting inside that divine love, which you cannot describe because it's not from this world, but at the same time, you do know that this is more real than the relative world and anything that happens here. You know that this is a play. This is a play, and there's light and dark. It's a shadow play of light and dark, and we're here. We're playing our roles. But I think the idea is that I think what we all really want is the divine love, and in the network, I was going to be part of, an agenda, the agenda for the people, which was, of course, the pedophile agenda, but also the romance agenda. And I think a lot of people that are used the way I was, they are pushed into that belief system that the highest love you can know when you're a human being is romance, and which is basically through sex, which is which is not really about love. So going through that, for me, understanding romance and romantic love and that relationship with the gangster, which was so intense and marked me so deeply, when it comes to romantic love, just to really go through that and heal from that, really without a spirit, there would be nothing. And I found myself in lack most of my adult life. But I was screaming at God and saying, I need more help. And I am craving being held, and, and it wouldn't necessarily come. It was very isolating. I was very isolated. But here I am, you see, and I'm very grateful now for everything. I really am. I feel very held, and I'm moved by the divine love, which is just, it's not only everything, but it is just so difficult to allow it in. But that's the bliss, that's the reality, and that's the bliss, I think, that we ultimately are.
I went through a very dark period in my life, which was a walk in the park for sure compared to yours, but I fell into a darkness, and which led to me starting my recovery when I was 25. And at the end, I was starving for love. I mean, I was really starving for love. The people that I was hanging out with were just not capable of love. And I don't think that at the end of that period of my life, I believe that I had become a spiritual invalid. I was incapable of giving or receiving love. And at the end, it was, I felt so, so famished. And I had to cultivate a relationship with a spiritual relationship. And it was stops and starts. I'd lived with an Indian guru when I was 19, and I'd been in a Sufi group for a while. I'd been in a Zen group. I'd been in a Krishnamurti group. I'd been in a Gurdjieff group. And I'd studied philosophy in college. And despite all of that, I realized I was spiritually bankrupt. All that knowledge didn't mean anything. That I had, despite that knowledge had fed my ego. It hadn't fed my soul.
Right.
And I had drifted very far away from love. And you talk about a certain type of indifference that you develop to survive. And this is a quote from your book: my indifference does not equal equanimity, but rather numbs anger and many other overwhelming negative emotions I could not possibly let myself feel. I am not unattached.
Yeah.
So at that point, that was the best you could do, was to become indifferent to everything, essentially.
Well, that was that was an extremely intense time after Peter was murdered. And so I was dealing with that incredible loss and all the guilt from the way we parted on top of it. Just really couldn't handle. And of course, the man who murdered him was my only thread to life. So I was clearly not unattached, but I didn't know what else to do, but to go completely numb. And I guess then he would come and sort of like domestic violence, you have nowhere to go but completely freeze and go numb. And then he would come and need to feel loved again. And then by that time, it was only through violence that he could make me go back to that place where I loved him, or where I expressed love to him, or where I felt that I loved him.
And this is what you wrote. You went through various types of tortures, and this is what you wrote. I don't know if I will continue to exist in some form or just be wiped out. I don't know anything anymore. I don't feel ready to die. So you didn't want to die, but yet you become extremely indifferent to existence. And I
No,
think,
I don't think so. I mean, that was the indifference was something, but when I was tortured, I had some spiritual experiences. I didn't really feel the pain for the longest time, and then suddenly I felt all the pain. Um, so, but there was that awareness in that moment that there was still fear and I wasn't ready to die.
and the head of the network, you call him Polo in your book, but he actually became a prime minister of Belgium.
He had been, I believe, he was prime minister twice, and at the time he was Minister of National Defense. That's Paul van den Boeynants, yeah.
And what's it like knowing that someone who is the prime minister of your country is an absolute monster?
Oh, I didn't know that he was the prime minister or anything. I didn't know who he was.
Oh, okay.
No, I didn't know who anybody was when I was young. I found
Okay.
him all.
And we talked about the defilement of innocence, and in your book, you write, enslaved in a cult which turns everything on its head. Bad is good, darkness is light. The worst one is the better. And that has been told by many, many survivors that have been through what you've been through, that all the values are inverted. And you talk about the people that you dealt with that are running the world. Without those at the top needing to be there, and without us handing over our power to those who automatically abuse it, all injustices on earth would be instantly eradicated. The power imbalances embedded into the hierarchy hide the simple truth that we are one species, inherently equal. And Thorstein Veblen was an economist. He's one of my favorite thinkers. And Karl Marx had said that the chasm between the bourgeoisie and the working class had become so wide that revolution is inevitable. And Veblen said that Marx was wrong, that he called them the leisure class. The leisure class will groom the working class to be predatory, just like them.
Hmm.
And I can see it playing out in our national politics and around the world, that people have been groomed to be predatory. And Veblen's book, Theory of the Leisure Class, is really, I read it many, many years ago, but it was kind of a big bang for me. It opened me up to a lot of things.
Mhm.
And finally, you do find a therapist. How do you disengage from the network?
Yes, I'll tell you, but I want to speak to the inversion because psychologically, I think that inversion comes from the sad state of affairs, psychological state of affairs of the perpetrators who do not know love and do not know innocence, and so they don't believe in it. And so I believe that the inversion comes from the belief that it becomes created, and giving yourself to Satan. This is a dualistic realm. There's light and dark, and you can say that it's the realm of Satan because we're all in physical bodies, and we believe to some extent that we are these bodies. And we're looking, and the way our senses work is we are perceiving a physical world, even though it is highly questionable that a physical world exists at all, that it really is all light. And um, perpetrators, having lost their innocence, and I believe this happens very young, like I had this reflection of my innocence from this woman, and I have, in going back and remembering, felt once again what it was like to be loved. But I also remember what it was like to be around my mother when it was just all projection. And my mother, who didn't believe in her own innocence, who then didn't see innocence in me, and then projected darkness onto me. And I remember feeling evil as a baby. And I remember, my mother seeing me as powerful and evil when I was a helpless baby. And I think if someone receives these projections only, and especially at a very young age or the first 3 years, parents that don't see the innocence in the child, and if you don't have spiritual experiences to connect you with that innocence, I don't think you know yourself as innocent. That's to say, as light, as more than the body. So knowing yourself as the body and more than that gives you strength. And all the strength comes from spirit. So if I said no, it was because I didn't care if they were going to kill me. And I preferred, even as a child, to be killed rather than to sell my soul. So, but you have to have courage. I mean, the courage comes from spirit already. You have to have faith. You can't have courage unless you have faith that you're not going to completely disappear, that once your body is destroyed, you will be destroyed and your consciousness will be destroyed. If you believe that, then it's sort of a very sad state of affairs for psychologically for that person. And from there, I believe that whole belief system that the Satanists carry is from that place of not believing in innocence. So then you might as well give yourself over to the material, to God, and that is the biblical deal, that they do sell their soul to Satan. They do receive power and material goods. And that is the classic story of evil. But that's what it is. I believe it comes from there.
The Faustian Pact.
Yeah.
I,
And I've seen people in that process, you see, in rituals. And I was also I was a bride of Satan as well.
in the extreme abuse survey, a number of people answered that question in the affirmative. Were you married to Satan? And do you think when you're in that type of an environment that you're susceptible to demons? Do you
Of
think
course,
demons are in that environment and that you're susceptible to them?
absolutely. And yes, you are, we're all vehicles, and those lower astral beings, they are separate entities, they are separate intelligences, but low vibrationally. And they do want a physical body, inhabit a physical body in order to have sexual pleasure or the lust of violence, which, people consciously open themselves up for demons to take over, or it happens. And absolutely, yes. But I think that happens more than people know. Like I think if you give yourself completely to your anger, you may not know, but you may already have an entity attaching to you in that moment to ride that ride. They are looking for these negative emotions. And I'm not at all about bypassing, obviously. I'm just saying that it might be more common than we know. We have to be careful.
When you were talking about the light and going towards the light, I had a chat with a physicist some years ago. He worked at the particle accelerator in Stanford. And we were talking about uh, Einstein, which I had one episode on Einstein and relativity, and my viewers didn't really resonate with it. But anyway, Einstein felt that everything was one. And I was talking to this physicist, and he told me that he believes that right now we've got quarks and all kinds of strange little uh, particles that we don't that act differently under different circumstances, and it's difficult to physics is still looking for the holy grail, whether it be string theory or quantum mechanics. But he said he felt that ultimately everything will be able to be reduced to photons, to light, that light is everything.
I think
And
that's what Einstein said too. Yeah. I mean, Einstein's theory of relativity just centers everything around the speed of light. And the speed of light is not you know, it's like everything is reduced to that sole absolute. And, dimension of time and space are, falling away in that absolute. And it's not an absolute because of the actual speed, but only because a body becomes denser as it speeds up. And so the only way to meet the speed of light would be to have the body has to be infinite. And I think that is the law of miracles, that saints and the enlightened ones can play with the light rays because they fulfill that their consciousness has expanded and is infinite, and because it is, they can perform miracles and do whatever they want, playing with those creative rays. Being in the astral world, in the world of light, you could say, on the other side of the ether, in a near-death experience, I definitely feel that also that this is the truth behind the physical mask where everything originates. So whatever happens in our life, it originates from the astral and then it manifests.
you eventually got into Paramahansa Yogananda, and I read autobiography of a yogi many, many years ago. As I said earlier, I lived with a guru when I was 19. I found out that he was a lower chakra lecher, and I let other people know. And then I was
Another
banished.
one, another one.
Yes, I've looked into many Indian gurus, and something goes wrong with them. I don't know if it goes wrong with them over there. I don't know if it goes wrong with them over here.
I
But
think that's related to the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras, is all about the cities. And the only thing that it says, it describes all the cities, meaning you go on a spiritual quest, and life after life after life, you develop greater concentration, you develop greater abilities because of your meditations, and you meditate more, you develop greater powers. And it says about the cities, basically, don't worry about them because you really want to get to your enlightenment. But I think that a lot of the gurus that we see, most of them false gurus, they fall for the power. There's nothing like spirituality to completely confuse everything, because somebody who's a CAO, nobody looks at them as a guru in terms of a spiritual enlightened being. In the physical yoga world, so I do the meditation with Yogananda's organization, but I also did a lot of physical yoga. And so, oh my goodness, it's just rife with these people that are literally teaching a physical practice, but acting like they're actually spiritual teachers, and they know and they make themselves the biggest authority figure. And I think the temptation of power is too great for most of these people. And in general, I think power is the greatest temptation because, of course, it gets you everything. It makes it look like you could get away. Makes it seem like you can get away with anything, and any bad habit you've got left over, you can cover it with power. Of course, it gives you the drugs, it gives you the money, it gives you the sex, it gives you everything you want, and you can hide it from the world. And I think that the temptation of power is too great for most of these false gurus out there. And then it always goes to the need for power in the first place comes from some trauma, that the more you are in a position of power, the less you are invited, the more privilege you have, the more you get projected up upon, the less you are invited to actually heal, the less you are invited to be confronted with, like a man who's pretending to be a huge guru. He's not going to go sit with somebody who takes him back to when he was 4 years old and he was being molested, which was the cause of his need to be seen as this big man because he felt so humiliated at that time, for example.
After I left the guru, I looked into a lot of gurus, Indian gurus after that, and every one of them had lower chakra issues. And I had an affinity towards Tibetan Buddhism too. And every one of those guys has lower chakra issues. A woman that I knew who was affiliated with my guru all those years ago, she let a Tibetan monk live with her. And there's pictures of him. He's in his saffron robe and he's looking very spiritual. And then there's a picture of him like 6 months later and he's wearing a suit. And then there's a picture of him 4 months later and he's got a drink and a girl on his arm. I mean, it was fascinating, these pictures, to watch this de-evolution of this monk, and
The devolution, rather.
and maybe he came here with pure motives. I don't know, but he
Many
certainly.
people start out with pure motives and with
What's
good
that?
intentions. I think many people start out with pure motives and good intentions. Yeah, but then comes a temptation. And that's always the road of power, is always that it is very hard. If you say you follow truth, that's following spirit. Because if you follow truth, and that is your own truth, in uncovering what, if you're getting overwhelmed with memories, that's your own truth. And then, of course, the truth in the world, if you follow truth and you have integrity, there is always a price to pay, and you'll always be isolated from the group. It is a spiritual path. The way that the Western society is set up is trauma-based, that those people at the top are basically perpetuating their own trauma and putting it onto everybody through privilege, where the least privileged, the disenfranchised, get all the trauma heaped on them, and everybody gets, some. Everybody has to pay the price, and it works together as this inverted, with this inverted belief system where it is about passing on trauma, really. The Aleister Crowley people, do as thou wilt, the 33rd degree in the Masons is do as thou wilt. And when you think of that, it's very surprising that do as thou wilt means going to a ditty party, or means, doing harm to others. If it was really what you want, there would be more billionaires that want to do good in the world, and that want to just eradicate hunger in one day, which would be easy to do. Or good in the world, but the reason that it's not possible is because of the network. That power means at this moment it's only to abuse it, and I say that as an absolute. It isn't. There's many people in many different situations, but the road to power is so that it's always about choices. And when you're in a structure that is the classic hierarchy power structure, on your way up, you are definitely going to have to, at some point, close your mouth about something that you see happening that's not cool if you want to stay with it. And then if you go farther, it's going to get more and more narrow in terms of how to remain on this, a good person and really have your integrity and also belong to the power. And I I made it was very difficult to live for me because I was drawn to environments where there's power. There were powerful people, but I was always choosing against it as partly my reprogrammation, which which had me just sort of seek, um, to be underneath always because of that program, but also certain moments where there was a choice and then not choosing for power and then immediately paying the price and whatever it is, getting laughed at, certainly not being seen for the integrity that you have, and then um you know and then not really having the self-esteem either to replace it, because you do this, you keep going because you don't have the self-esteem to have the integrity. That's why you do it. That's why it's trauma based. But if you do, and so I didn't have the self-esteem, but I didn't want the power. And so it was just feeling how awful it feels to be humiliated and then going to therapy and trying to get behind it there. But it was just very, very difficult, I can tell you.
I've bypassed a number of the humiliations that you had to endure when you were a child, and they're very horrific. And you say this in your book: healing has us going against the outward tide, asking us to stop, to reverse the flow and go inward. So to heal, basically, you're going against the grain of society.
It's true. Nothing is set up for healing. Certainly not if you're a middle class white person. Um, because I worked with underserved populations, and there's actually things available. If you know where to look, there are a lot of organizations and everything that will help you up to a certain point. Um, I had a guest on who also was helped by a center in New York City. I think the Rape Crisis Center helped him, and then he stayed in therapy there. But I always paid for my therapy. And while you're in therapy and you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders because it's so dark what you're healing from, I got fired a lot. I was not very functional, and plus I was not a very good employee. So, because I didn't know, I was only comfortable one-on-one with a man, and so I would get hired, but then I was not any good at the job, or it was boring, and then I got fired. So to and or I fall into a chasm, of despair of the things that I'm dealing with. And it was just too difficult. I was crying so much sometimes. I would cry at work. I couldn't, stop crying because I was grieving so much of everything that was happening. So in my time, there's certainly no compassion ever that I received from any kind of place where I was working or any bosses, never. And of course, I wasn't a very good employee. Let's not forget that. I mean, it may be different for other people. But my experience was I couldn't find anything, when I couldn't find any support, really. I couldn't find a setup where I could focus on healing alone, for example. Except I did in my marriage eventually. That was when I did it.
And you had difficulties finding a therapist that could help you heal.
Yes.
You were ultimately able to find a therapist that was well versed in dissociative identity disorder and not so much in the occult, on the occult side of the abuse. That's what I got from your book.
That's right. She was a Freudian therapist, actually, but not an analyst, or she never asked me to lie down. It was face to face, and she was just very compassionate and patient and very sweet. And so, we talked a lot about boundaries. And she was able to hold it. She sometimes clarified things because she could see she was not afraid of how dark people can be. So she was realistic that way. So that's why she was safe. And she was also extremely thorough. So I felt held. Yeah.
And did you go for integration or just to have a working system of
I didn't have
parts?
anything. I didn't do the parts work the way that many of us did, because that's not really what she focused on. At the time, she was a mother figure who offered a container, and mostly what I received was a valid reflection so that the little girl that I was, the part that was active, could get this new perspective of the situation and could unload the shame and guilt that were attached to that part. And with it, all the feelings, and then the doubts also, because this not wanting this to be real, it stayed for a really long time. I didn't want this to be true.
And are you still working through it or have you gotten to the other side?
I have gotten to the other side, although I'm also still working through it. I've gotten to the other side because there's a certain point at which I think that I had grieved enough so that when something comes now, it's the grief is very brief. It can be just barely even, but because I think I've gone through so much, it's more about the being cognizant and then allowing that awareness and then feeling, the feelings, but it could be brief and graceful, which it was not when I was younger. And there was a very important moment in 2013 when, which had to do with a guilt complex that I suffered from, and that was very much related to a murder that I had to perform. And it was the murder that I was made to perform before I left the network. So it was called an exit ritual in Belgium. And so again, there's no capes or anything. And it was, um, so there was, so I had memories of that for a long time, but I could not accept myself. I did not really want to be alive. There's this always this depression underneath that has to do with, taking a life and feeling that you are a killer. And I think it's the worst trauma, actually.
I've
And
been told that by other survivors too.
yeah. And the last puzzle piece was that I knew I had not had the memories yet of the mind control, but I realized that I knew because I was given a choice, which was never a choice, but I thought I could have just said no anyway. And it came to me, I'd been writing a lot about it, and it came to me that the knowledge came because I didn't know where it came from, but the knowledge came and it settled very strongly that if I had said no, they would have made it worse for the victim. And that's how I was trained in the Delta training years earlier. If you don't do it, it will be worse for the victim, and that will be your fault. And when that puzzle piece fell into place, and when I knew that, I finally realized that I never wanted to harm this girl. I never wanted to kill her. I never wanted to do anything. And that even though I had held the knife and even though I had gone through the motions, because, you know, when you have a knife, you have to handle it too. And you're the person going through the experience of killing. And I had to get myself into a state to do it. So even though I had experienced all these feelings and even the high, I realized that all of that is apart from me and what I actually wanted. And when I finally understood that, that was when I felt literally the birth of self-esteem. And things changed very drastically afterwards in my physical world afterwards, because that self-esteem, suddenly I was operating differently because I had because I had this core of self-esteem restored. And so that was, so the healing changed after that. And then I became more, I went public. I had an interview. I was working in the prisons at the time, and I had an interview, and I just answered the question instead of avoiding answering the question about my past. So I went public, and I also um, started an organization bringing yoga into prisons, and I just became very active in service. And so the healing, it was more about serving others, and it was more about um, yeah, following this path now that I'm on now. And so the healing continues, of course, and at times still very intense, but it is different now. It is easier.
Being of service is an esteemable act, and I think people get self-esteem through esteemable acts. And you seem to have found a spiritual home with Eastern philosophy.
Not only Eastern self-realization fellowship. I mean, Yogananda was in contact with Christ. So Christ is one of the gurus of self-realization. I just spent all of Saturday in meditation. They do 8-hour meditations for Christmas. So um, no, it's very much both paths of yoga. Original yoga and original Christianity is really the path. And I was originally much more drawn to Eastern philosophies because my parents are Catholics. So my mother and stepfather are Catholics, and we went to church, and the priest was having an affair with my mother. And so I really only got that false, I always liked the figure of Jesus, but I never heard anybody speak about him sincerely. But I always liked, for example, that Christ didn't seek glory. Christ, came into Jerusalem on the donkey. He didn't want the big triumph march as he could have had. And I always appreciated the obvious humility of Christ. But I was very allergic, you could say, to anything having to do with Catholicism and that version. I get a lot of people now who tell me that because I do yoga, clearly I'm still satanic and I'm still influenced by Satan. And I think, oh, it's those are Christians that are telling me that. That's sort of like, no, that's what I want to get away from. Like, no, let's just, Christ would never judge anybody else for their religion.
I didn't really have a lot of religion growing up. And then when I was 13, I was sent to a military school. And the two primary texts in the military school were the Bible and Lord of the Flies. And it was a very, very violent place.
Wow.
Violence was condoned at that place. I really hated that place. As much as I can hate anything, I hated that place. And I was there for a year. And at 14, I just said, the hell with it all. I'm not, at 14, I said to myself, God is dead. And I hadn't read Nietzsche at that point, but
You said.
that's essentially what I said to myself. And then I said, well, I don't really want to play sports anymore because I was a good athlete. And, I really don't want to go to school too much either. So that was a pivot. And but what's interesting is I started reading Eastern philosophy when I was 15. I was attracted to Eastern philosophy when I was 15. I wanted nothing to do with any kind of Western thought. And as my pursuit of Eastern philosophy has continued, it ultimately led me to Christianity. I would consider myself a Christian, but I think that the vast majority of Christians would not consider me a Christian. There's maybe 5 people that I know that would probably consider me a Christian. So, but
Yogananda wrote the best commentary on the New Testament. So that is really how I can finally read the Bible, because this commentary is basically um, the deeper meanings, the deeper meanings of the parables. And the words of Christ are pretty clear usually, but sometimes they certainly get misrepresented or misconstrued.
I think the most radical message of all time is love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
That is very radical. That if you love your neighbor as yourself, then you want your neighbor to have a place to live. You want your neighbor to have food. You want your neighbor to have health care. I've always looked upon that as a radical message, and I see how Christianity has gotten away from that.
Well, it's first love God first, and then your neighbor as yourself. And I think the loving God first is so important in the sense that we are all children of God. And if we know ourselves to be children of God, then obviously we're all brothers and sisters. And then we can love our neighbor as ourselves. I think you need to love God first, because without loving God, you can't really love yourself, because it's love yourself as what? Not as the physical body, but as a soul, as part of spirit.
In the New Testament, I can't remember which gospel it is, but Christ says, if you say you hate somebody but love God, you're a liar.
Yeah.
And I think that brings us kind of around to what is being taught in Eastern philosophy, Eastern spirituality, that everything is one, that we're all one. And and hating someone is essentially hating that thing that you are a part of.
Yes, and obviously the challenge is great when you've been horribly abused as a child, and you do, so what I say is that, or my experience is that the healing process, all feelings, all negative feelings have their place in the healing process. So anger is the first survival instinctual reaction. Fight. You fight because you kill the opponent. That's why you get filled with adrenaline when you're being threatened, when your life is being threatened. So that's the trauma. You fly into fight mode first. Then if you can't fight, your amygdala says fly. You go running, and now you're running from the threat. And finally, if that doesn't work, it says freeze. Now you're just in this state where most children are that are being sexually abused, when you cannot move, your blood flows more slowly. You will not feel the pain. You may even feel pleasure. Very difficult to understand that once your brain comes back online, that you didn't do anything often. But these initial instinctual survival mechanisms that are completely used and abused in the network for the mind control, but that initial fight, I say that from the initial suppressed fight instinct come all forms of anger, and the need for power comes out of suppressed anger. And all addictions come out of the suppressed flight instinct. All compulsions and addictions come basically out of that. And of course, freeze is where, where everything gets suppressed. And I found that, in the cycle of healing, it's so important to feel the anger finally towards the perpetrators, because as long as it's not been connected, as long as that instinctual reaction has not been felt towards, connected to the original trauma, that's to say, connected to the person that put your life in danger, you you will have it in you, and you will either turn it to others or you will turn it against yourself, but you can't get rid of it until you find that integration, feeling the anger directed towards the original perpetrator in order to move forward. And it's the same, of course, with all kinds of manners of fleeing, and it's the same with all the things that are suppressed from the free state. So to have the meaning, the pain, the grief, the fear, everything needs to be felt again, and there's room for it in that cycle of healing. But there's really, most of us live in some kind of trauma loop, I call it. People react, and that's they're triggered, and then they're reacting, and then they get into situations with people that are just dramatizations of early childhood wounds that haven't been healed. And I think that's our goal now, is to heal ourselves in the context of healing, of changing, the world.
In your book, as I said earlier, I was struck by when you talked about your perpetrators, you talked about their parts and the trauma that you leave, at least me, to think that you're talking about the trauma that they endured. How is it possible? I mean, you can develop some kind of empathy with your perpetrators because they have parts, but how is forgiveness possible?
Well, forgiveness was only possible. First of all, it's a work in progress. It's not like tomorrow I cannot be extremely furious at one of my perpetrators. That happens all the time, and then I just have to work through it again. Or to other people, or at other people, or at other people. It's rather that it is this an awareness of we are all one, and that behind. So I found forgiveness for my mother in this way, that my mother was never aware of herself as a soul, and I never saw it either. And the last time I saw my mother, I saw her eyes were like glassy, like classic evil eyes. They looked completely empty, and they're light blue on top of it, so it's like what you think when you think of an evil person. That's what her eyes looked like. So my mother never knew herself to be a soul, nor did she ever express it. So I never saw it. And it was my assumption that, okay, it's not because I don't see it that it isn't there. There's a suffering soul behind this body-mind system. And because she has no connection to the soul, that suffering will be rather great, in fact.
You've been on
Although,
that. Go ahead. Sorry.
although I don't know if her suffering was great because she was a psychopath. So I don't actually know if her suffering was great, but it will be at least. I believe in, reincarnation, and definitely like makes no sense there would be only one life because then there's no divine justice. But so that's how I worked it out. I assume that there's a soul and that this soul is the light and is goodness itself, but the person has no access to it. And that's how I can forgive because I understand there's spiritual suffering there.
You've been on some big podcasts that reference your book, or people that are talking about your book. How has it been received? I saw that you were on Patrick Bet David's podcast, Valuetainment. How was that received, or how was your book received on these larger podcasts?
Well, there's an issue because my book is not to be found on Amazon. It's not to be found anywhere in Europe. There was always a problem on Amazon that it couldn't be found in the Amazon search. You could Google it and then you could find it that way. And it was, of course, print on demand. So, but you could never find it in Amazon search, and there's always been problems. So I changed and I went to BookBaby, and BookBaby is supposed to put it on all platforms, except that I can't find it anywhere on Amazon now. And now there's an SEO problem that you can't find it, that you have to go directly to the BookBaby link. And so the response from that podcast has been very heartwarming in general, because I expected that the followers of PDB would be, initially tough like he was. And I found that immediately everyone seemed to be very aware and very, very supportive. And so very grateful for that. And I've just been, busy because I've had a lot of requests, also a lot from Europe, Germany, Holland, and countries there, and France, and I speak the language. So, I'm planning quite a few podcasts over there, and some here as well, but very small. I mean, not very small. Um, that was definitely the largest podcast I've ever been on. I usually am on, more modest platforms.
Had he, in fact, read your book?
Not at all. I think I think he saw a 5 minute video clip from 2016. I don't think he saw more. The things he brought up was from a 5 minute video clip that was going around in 2016.
I have been on innumerable podcasts over the years, and
Including that one, right?
no, I haven't been on his. And
Okay.
I've been on innumerable, and no one reads my books. They want to talk to me about my books, but they don't read them.
Well,
And
you're very generous because you not only read my book, but you're quoting from it. So.
well, I tried to read everybody's book that's on my podcast because I got so disgusted with knuckleheads who pull stuff off the internet that's apocryphal and think that it's part of the Franklin scandal. So, I mean, really disgusted. And I've actually voiced my disgust to some of the podcasters. So I really make an assiduous effort to read everybody's book that comes on my podcast. I can't read everybody's book, but I definitely try to. And your book was very compelling. As I said, you describe very horrific things, but your prose is very beautiful and very ornate. And Anneke's book is Quest for Love, Memoir of a Child Sex Slave. And I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Have yourself a great night, Anneke.
Okay. You too.
Bye.